Hello, everyone. I'm Brad Hill. Welcome to the RAIN Podcast Business Lunch. This is a weekly series of appointment viewing every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time, featuring conversations with knowledge leaders in the podcast industry. Now, if you're on the West Coast, this is probably more like podcast business breakfast. And if you're in Europe, maybe podcast business dinner or podcast business happy hour. Wherever you are, thank you for being here. Today is the inaugural episode, and our conversation guest is one of the most celebrated thought leaders in the podcast industry, Tom Webster from Edison Research. We discuss some key podcast measurements, as you might expect, and also the importance of YouTube, how smart speakers fit in, podcast revenue compared to streaming music revenue, the podcast subscription business, and what Tom might tell a podcaster who barged into his house. We'll get to the conversation with Tom in just a minute. I'm proud to say that the Podcast Business Lunch is presented by two staunch supporters of RAIN, NPR and Triton Digital. Here are a couple of messages from our friends at these companies.
This lunch is sponsored by NPR, a leader in audio journalism and storytelling for over 50 years. NPR delivers international, national, and local news and programming to audiences via radio, podcasts, and digital platforms. NPR offers brand sponsors an effective and measurable opportunity to connect with its 138 million monthly users who rely on the trusted and valued content provided by 35 news bureaus around the world and hundreds of public media member stations in communities across the country. NPR resonates with listeners and creates a compelling, uncluttered environment for your brand to do the same.
Triton Digital is the global technology and services leader to the digital audio and podcast industry. Triton provides innovative technology to broadcasters and podcasters to build their audience, maximize revenue, and streamline their day-to-day operations. In addition, Triton powers the global online audio industry with Webcast Metrics, the leading online audio measurement service, and Podcast Metrics, one of the first IAB-certified podcast measurement services in the industry. To learn more, visit us at tritondigital.com.
Sincere thanks to NPR and Triton Digital for encouraging and enabling this new RAIN venture. Their support has us looking forward to many valuable and interesting installments of this series starting today and in coming weeks. All right then, here is today's conversation with Tom Webster. Tom Webster is Senior Vice President of Edison Research. He's been with Edison for nearly 18 years. He has keynoted at conferences around the world. The Infinite Dial is Edison's flagship consumer research in the audio field, cited worldwide across all media coverage of online audio. If there's something to be known about consumer audio choices, habits, and trends, Tom knows it. He authors a newsletter called I Hear Things, which distills his knowledge as an audio researcher and extends his measurement work into enterprise wisdom for podcast creators at all levels. It's a great pleasure to speak with Tom today, and a privilege to have him inaugurate the Podcast Business Lunch series. Thank you, Tom, and welcome.
Thanks, Brad. It's a lot of pressure to be the inaugural speaker here. I'm afraid I'm going to set a horrible warning and not an example.
Please don't worry. All of what you've just speculated about is impossible, and I'm thrilled to have you. Edison has been doing Infinite Dial since 1998, and the podcasting trend lines go back to 2006, I think. Do you have a number one finding in that 15-year history of podcast year-over-year comparisons?
It's been kind of funny, Brad. It's been a very linear, steady growth slope for podcasting. It never really took off in the way that online video did, but it never stopped either. It just kept kind of chugging along bits at a time. I think I'm rarely surprised by things because we have so many data instruments out in the field at all times. But one kind of counterintuitive finding was a couple of years ago when the number of podcasts that weekly podcast consumers listen to dropped. And I think if you weren't a number savvy person, you might look at that as some kind of a warning sign. And it wasn't a warning sign at all. There were so many new listeners in, and they were casual listeners, and they were coming in through kind of non-traditional at the time platforms for podcasting, like Spotify, like YouTube, things that 10 years ago were not really part of the parlance of the podcasting universe. And these are just lots and lots of new people coming in, listening to a couple shows a week or one show a week. So to me, when that number of weekly podcasts kind of dropped, I took that as a healthy sign that podcasting was coming kind of out of its shell of only like satisfying a core group of people to having secondary and tertiary listeners. And that is really the sign of a healthy medium. So when that happened, I think some people looked at that and were a little stunned by it or shocked or asking questions. It all looked normal to me. And so I think that it didn't necessarily surprise me, but it was an unusual thing to see. So we dug into it.
Mm-hmm. I remember that. Yeah, it was startling. And I remember you addressing it at the Infinite Dial presentation that year. Speaking of number one findings, in the US, Latino podcast listenership last year grew 44%. And I bring this up because that was your number one finding in 2021. You do a number one finding every year. I'm not asking for a prediction of a key 2022 metric, but what are you most looking forward to finding out in 2022?
Well, I'm not a forecaster, Brad. That's something I've resisted constantly in my career. So I'm not going to predict whether or not podcasting grows or how much it grows. I think that interferes with my job as my job is to describe the present as best I can. I think what I'm really curious about, though, in terms of podcasting, is going to be the relative popularity of the various genres and topics of podcasts. And this is something that I do write about from time to time. I mean, right now, if you look at the top genres in podcasting, it's, comedy is number one in our podcast consumer tracker, but you have things like true crime that are very, very high. And we've had a weird couple of years, right? We've had with this sort of being the start of year 3 of COVID-19 disruptions, it kind of is what it is at this point. And I think that's impacted what genres are popular, what genres aren't popular. But I wonder if, is true crime really the catnip of this medium or not? I mean, and one of the things I like to look at, and I've made this comparison a couple of times, what are the most popular movies? What are the most popular TV shows? They don't look anything like the most popular podcasts. And on the one hand, you can look at that and say, that's because podcasting is its own weird and wonderful snowflake, and it is. But on the other, you can also look at it and say, well, maybe there's even more potential for podcasting to reach mainstream Americans that have yet to really find their show. And really, that's all it takes, I think, for people to embrace the medium it's just to find their show.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I have watched with amazement as the true crime category deepens and deepens and deepens and seems to continually verify and re-verify the decision to produce serial, which arguably launched the modern era of podcasting. And also, when it comes to comedy, I have a bone to pick here with how comedy is characterized. Because shows which are not funny and do not particularly try to be funny, but are hosted by comedians, Mark Maron, for example, Dax Shepard, they're very popular, but they're really just interview shows. And there doesn't seem to be a chat category or an interview category which I think would break up that comedy stronghold a bit. What do you think?
Well, I think there's something to that, Brad. And, in some ways, when we are tracking those things in our podcast consumer tracker data, we're matching the podcasts that people name to the Apple. We're using the Apple API to match the category for that. And so we're kind of limited by that. And so we're not making those judgment calls. It's actually the producer of the podcast that's entering it in as, comedy or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think certainly you can listen to Armchair Expert. You can listen to WTF with Mark Maron. You can listen to Joe Rogan. And on any given day, they're not very funny. And I think would probably more likely slot into current affairs, sometimes politics, sometimes alternative health and wellness. I don't know where you would put some of that stuff. We are sort of limited by that category designation that people do use. And that's, again, that the producers use. But I think, ultimately humor is important in a lot of the genres that are out there, and a lightness, I think. And that, I think, is certainly relevant to, again, where we've been the last couple of years. And I think podcasting has become an escape for a lot of people. One of the things that I like to talk about in terms of the media related disruptions of COVID-19, what really kind of went away in the early days of the pandemic was, quote unquote, me time. Yes, we don't have to go to the office anymore, or at least we didn't at that time. I'm still not in the office. But the thought that we would have all of this spare time was not true, right? There's all of this stuff to do at home. Many of us were homeschooling children. And so what kind of went away in for a large stretch of the pandemic was, me time. And so I think for a lot of people, where podcasting started as primarily an educational vehicle, I think people listened to podcasts in the early days primarily to learn new things, became very much an escapist vehicle for people over the past couple of years. So, while I think comedy does get overstated, it ain't nothing. And having a good laugh, I think, is something we could all welcome right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do recognize that it's self-selected by the producers. Infinite Dial measures 3 podcast listening levels. There is whether the respondent has ever listened to a podcast, the ever level. There's monthly listening, or having listened at least in the past month, and weekly listening. To me, those engagement levels represent unengaged for the nevers, dabbling perhaps for the monthly, and habituated for the weekly. Is that a sensible way to look at it? And which of those 3 charts interests you the most?
Well, I think that is a sensible way to look at it. I mean, I think if you are in the kind of evers and are not a monthly or weekly listener, then the system has failed you somehow. The one thing I can tell you is, with over 4 million podcasts listed in the podcast index, there's a podcast for you out there, and the system has failed you, I think, if you haven't found it. There is the ratio that I like to look at from weekly to monthly to evers. There are almost twice as many evers as there are weeklies. Is that a ratio that can improve? I think it can, as people discover podcasts more and discover the right show for them. But I do think that's a fair way to look at it. And ultimately, I like to look at the weekly podcast consumers, because those are the people that have they haven't just found a show, because many of the most popular podcasts are not ongoing every single week. They're mini series, they're short series, they're limited engagements. But when you do make time for podcasts every single week, then I think you're really habituated to the medium, as you say. So I do like to look at that. That's why we base our podcast consumer tracker research on weekly listeners. For that matter, our share of ear data is all based on daily consumption. So I think when you are a weekly listener, it's a part of your life. It's not just I happen to find a random show, and that's where we like to kind of start our analysis.
Mm-hmm. In your international consumer studies, a picture of podcasting around the world comes into focus. Different regions organize around podcasting at different times and at different rates and in different ways. Looking at it all, is there an international podcast trend or interesting metric that stands out for you?
A lot of it is, certainly you have to look at the content that is being generated. Is how much content is being generated in the native language of that country. And there are stories out there that are only just now beginning to be told. I think there's an enormous surge of podcasts in Brazil, for instance. There's lots and lots and lots of people doing podcasts about football. So those things are out there. I think the rate limiting factor for podcasting continues to be the cost of data and the availability of ubiquitous, cheap wireless broadband. That's the rate limiting factor that we have seen country to country. For example, in Canada, we've done infinite dial research for the last 4 or 5 years, and podcasting and streaming audio both took a significant step up when the data plans in that country got a little bit more sensible. 4 or 5 years ago, the per capita cost as a percentage of income that mobile broadband cost in Canada was, I think, among the 5 highest in the world. It was enormously expensive, and that was a real break on the growth of all forms of digital audio. That break has been largely removed, and you've seen the demand catch up in countries like Canada. So we see high demand in many of the infinite dial countries that we've researched, Australia, Canada, and then in some other countries where, mobile broadband is either not quite as developed or it's a little bit more expensive. The last time we looked at Germany, for instance, you do see, the usage a little bit lower. But I think there's pent up demand there. And I think there's demand that is only going to get greater as more and more content is produced in the native language of those countries.
Let's swing over to podcasts and smart speakers. From your viewpoint of what is and what could be, is podcast listening on smart speakers at a good level?
Well, at a good level, I'm not going to cast a value judgment here. I will say that podcasting underperforms on smart speakers compared to what it does on smartphones. I mean, the smartphone has really been the driver of podcast consumption globally. And you could look at this one of two ways. You could look at this as, an opportunity. Perhaps it's not as easy to listen to podcasts on smart speakers. It's in fact very difficult to go back and look at, kind of evergreen back catalog of podcasts. That's very hard to do on a smart speaker that doesn't have a screen. But I think you also have to look at the modality that people are in when they're listening to a podcast versus when they are using their smart speaker. Most people already have a perfectly good way to listen to podcasts. So you can look at the fact that podcasting kind of punches below its weight on a smart speaker as a failing, or you could just look at it that we haven't really been given a better reason to do something different. And really, we can listen to podcasts just fine on our smartphones. We're used to doing that. I think as someone who is a fan of the medium, I'm not interested in relitigating that and trying to get another behavior tacked onto there. But there's no question that podcasting is more difficult. I think podcast listening is a little bit more difficult without a screen to be able to go back and kind of search for exactly the right show. And some of that also has to do, I think, with voice search. And, if you look at what we call podcasts, right? Even I think a show like The Daily, I mean, The Daily in our podcast consumer tracker research is the number 2 most widely listened to podcast in America, right? Enormous reach, second only to Rogan. But it takes some sort of special accommodation by a voice search engine for you to ask a smart speaker to say, play The Daily, and for it to know what you're talking about. It's a fairly generic term, right? So I don't know that we will ever see podcast consumption on smart speakers equal to what it is on the smartphone. I'm not sure it's meant to be. I think we know how to listen to podcasts, and we're fine listening to them wherever that is.
Indeed, yeah. And I noticed in the Smart Audio Report, by the way, co-produced by Edison and NPR, that podcasts, the word podcast, I think, doesn't appear in the report at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that we track. We have years and years of research going back on it, and I think really we're looking at kind of more holistic usage of these devices in things like the Smart Audio Report, and people do tend to use them for more utilitarian purposes. One of the perverse things that we noted a couple of years ago in the Smart Audio Report is, kind of two things. The longer you've had these devices in your home, the more important they are to you in terms of something you don't want to be without. But the longer you've had them in your home, the fewer things you do with them. And I think this is a bit of a conundrum for people working in voice technology, is that we have grown accustomed to them as utilities to do some very simple things that help us out. But we're not necessarily interested in going deeper than set a timer for me, tell me when my laundry's done, and play the radio for me, or play a streaming service for me, or so on. So I think that's an innovation challenge for people that are in voice technology, because mostly what we want is something that helps us when our hands are full. So it's a very utilitarian device.
That's a good way to put it. It's fair to say, Tom, that in your keynotes and newsletters, you bang on YouTube's drum, or to put it differently, you bang on podcasters to get onto YouTube. Explain why, please. And also, is it working? Have podcasters thanked you for that advice?
Podcasters rarely thank me. I don't know. I'm like the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down for podcasting sometimes. So here's why I think it's important. Number one, we know from our research, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it is an incredibly important channel for trial. Now, it may not be how you regularly consume podcasts, but when you ask people, how do you ever listen to podcasts? And, you can choose multiple selections here. YouTube has been at first for quite some time now. And it's the place where you might encounter something. Now, maybe later on, you'll listen to it on a dedicated podcast client or some other channel, but you find stuff on YouTube. And what's important here is that YouTube is a possible solution to one of the most common problems that we hear from podcasters about the medium is discovery. And I'm not sure that podcasting as an entire medium has a discovery problem, but your podcast has a discovery problem. It can be really hard to get your podcast out there. And yet we have this incredible search engine for content, possibly the best search engine for content that there is, one that is universally available to people, that does not require an account, does not require a premium subscription. If I tell you to find something and I want you to find a particular show, I don't know if you have a particular podcast client. I don't know if you have a Spotify account or a Pandora account, but I know you can find it on YouTube. And that's what's important to me. And I think it's mostly for podcasters, it's mostly not working, right? It's mostly not working because what works best on YouTube are things that are made for YouTube. It's video, it's bespoke for the channel. So don't get me wrong. But I think what YouTube gives you the possibility to do is to showcase your content in a way that people can find if you commit to that channel for that purpose. And to me, there's a couple of ways that people are thinking about it now, but I think the answer is the third way. I think the two ways that people are thinking about it now is, A, let's just dump my podcast on YouTube. I'm not sure that works great. I think that works fine if you're somebody like Pod Save America and you are actually having video of John Favreau talking and there's a thing to watch. So I think that works better, obviously. But if you just dump your podcast on YouTube, I'm not sure that works great. And you can get punished by YouTube's algorithm if you're not engaging people. And the other way to think about it is, well, it's a place to put up a trailer. Well, I think people are interested in trailers if they already know they're interested in a podcast, if they're already looking for a thing. But I think one of the potential things that people could look at for YouTube, which again is an incredible search engine, it's an incredible way to suggest content for people, is coming up with a third thing, a thing sort of in and unto itself. It's not a tease like a trailer is, but it's something that pays off, beginning, middle, and end, right there, and says, look, this is an interesting little bit of content. Maybe you can get more by subscribing to the podcast, but thanks for watching us on YouTube. Here it is. It's a little piece of content. It's not a trailer. It's not a tease. It's not dumping the whole thing on, but it's a thing that's sort of made to showcase the quality of your content in and of itself. And I think as people begin to commit to the channel a little bit more than just kind of a dumping ground for existing content, I think they'll see that it actually is one of the potential solutions to podcasting's quote unquote discovery problem.
I'm going to quote from a recent newsletter of yours. And you said, on-demand music shows are the last best frontier for podcasting. When this happens, everything will change. End of quote. And I think you're referring to the legal riskiness or outright unlegality of putting music that has not been cleared for use in podcasting into a podcast. And of course, I agree that on-demand music shows would be eruptive for the industry. I do agree with that. My question is, will it ever happen?
As my real estate agent said, with money, you can do anything. And I think it will. I think it is happening on Spotify to some extent. It's not easy to do. It's not the quality of a listening experience that a radio show is. But it's getting there. You can use licensed music in a music show on Spotify, and that's.
And you did. I don't know whether.
I did. I found it. I did. I had a show, Brad. Thanks for bringing that up. I did a show called Deep Six for a while as an experiment to see how that would work out. And it was unsatisfying to me. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't like I couldn't produce good segues. I couldn't keep the flow to the station.
Yes. I did the same thing.
So I didn't like it.
And the segue was a problem for me as well.
Yeah, and I think you underestimate the segue. You underestimate how propulsive that can be in providing forward momentum for a listener. So I think the experience isn't there yet, and to some extent, that's a technical challenge more than it is a licensing challenge. But you're seeing the door open a crack, and once the door opens a crack, the genie does not go back in the bottle. I think, as far as consumer preferences go.
Tom, I have a complicated question for you. In share of ear, podcasts enjoy a 6% share in American listening. Streaming audio has an 18% share, 3 times as much. According to the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America, streaming music revenues in the US totaled about $10 billion in 2020 for that 18% share. Podcasting is reaching for $1 billion in revenue, even though they have about a third of the share that streaming music does. So it's a revenue disparity. And it's mostly due, I know this from the RIAA's reporting, it's due to streaming music subscriptions, which dump so much revenue into platforms like Spotify. So let's talk about podcast subscriptions. Several big networks jumped into the Apple product when it launched. Now, in your opinion, was that a box that needed to be checked, or is there really compelling consumer value in paying for podcasts?
I think there's compelling. I think it's a part of the puzzle. I don't think the thing that I've always maintained about podcasting is that it's going to thrive if there are multiple streams of revenue and multiple ways to make money. So are subscriptions important? Yes, they are. I think it's important not to kind of compare podcasting with streaming audio in that sense, right? Because if you subscribe to Spotify or Apple Music or Amazon Music, right, you are subscribing to all of the things. You know what I mean? You're not paying $9.99 a month for the Dua Lipa subscription. Like that's the fair comparison, I think, because podcasts are largely available for free, and we have gotten used to that. But we are used to paying in some way. We're used to paying for music. But I think podcasting is healthy when there are multiple streams of revenue, and I think it's important for people to have the option for subscription revenue. I think direct response revenue has been the driver of the medium for so many years. But if I were going to point to, why podcasting, I think revenue-wise, punches below its weight, frankly, in the audio sphere, it's just more and more brand advertising. And I think that's coming as brand advertisers are getting more comfortable with the medium and are starting to find ways to demonstrate the efficacy of brand advertising and podcasting. But those are the dollars that I think will start to flow in and make up that difference.
Mm-hmm. Tom, I have a final question for you, and it's a scenario. A beginning podcaster knocks on your door. You, being you, invite them in and serve them coffee. They ask what single thing, or maybe 3 things, they should do to become a sustaining podcaster, a sustainable podcaster. What would you tell them?
Well, the first thing I would tell them is know who you're for. And to me, this is the question that so many podcasters really fail over on, because you'll get sort of trapped in one of 2 ways. You will either describe, well, I think it's for everyone, which is a recipe for no one, or you'll get trapped into an interest area, right? Like by saying, well, it's a podcast for people that are interested in X. Well, there's a million things for people that are interested in X. But knowing who you're for is knowing a little bit more. It's knowing a level deeper about the audience that you actually want to reach. It isn't everyone, and it isn't people interested in needlepoint. It's some, wacky version of people that are interested in needlepoint. And your podcast is doing a thing for them that either challenges or entertains or provides expertise, but ultimately that you're proud of. So that would be the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say is to master your craft. And we can all get better. I am not a great podcaster, Brad, but I'm a better podcaster today than I was 5 years ago, than I was 10 years ago. I'm trying to master my craft, right? I'm trying to get better at the things and not just sort of opening the mic and rambling. I really try not to do that. I do a podcast every other week for my newsletter for I Hear Things, and I write the whole thing out. I spend a lot of time writing it out, so I don't have to spend so much time on editing because I've done that in the sort of the beginning of it, right? And then I think the third thing I would suggest is don't be afraid to tear it up and do something else. Because I think we hear a lot about pod fading. I absolutely hate pod fading. I'm going to give you some shows that have pod faded. Seinfeld. Cheers. Right? They all pod faded. Don't be afraid of pod fading. If it's not working, scrap it. Do something else. Don't be afraid to tear it up. And that whole stigma of pod fading is a ridiculous thing that gets applied only to podcasting and not to every other media. The difference between podcasting and television, one of many, but the salient one, is that in television, somebody else cancels you. But in podcasting, nobody cancels you. You can keep doing a crap show forever if you want to. But if you learn something new, don't be afraid to scrap it. I'm a big fan of if you're starting out, putting those first 5, 10 even podcasts under the bed, think about them for a while and then decide if they're really what you want to release. It's really difficult to make it in podcasting. Don't do it for the money. That's the wrong reason to do it. It's a trailing variable. It's very, very hard to make a living in podcasting.
And on that note of trailing variables, I want to thank you, Tom, for being our inaugural guest in the RAIN Podcast Business Lunch. It's a delight to talk to you as always. I hope to see you some year soon in person. And in the meantime, be well.
Thank you, Brad. A real privilege and an honor. It's great to talk to you again.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone here for being at the inaugural RAIN Podcast Business Lunch. I'm grateful to Tom Webster for launching this program with us, and many thanks to our sponsors of this series, National Public Radio and Triton Digital. None of this happens without them. A transcript of today's conversation will be available for reading and downloading on RAIN News. And while you're on the website, make sure you're subscribed to the RAIN Daily Digest newsletter. It's the publication of record for the business of online audio. It's free, and you'll know everything that happens with this show, too. That's all for today. Happy afternoon, everyone, or morning or evening. Cheers.